Okay. So we are going to pick up from chapter 6, and again, hope to finish two-thirds of the book today so that we can finish tomorrow. Finish the reading tomorrow. So just to pick up some of the threads, more than the plot of this novel, what I think is particularly interesting, as we've been discussing, is the mode of narration, which seems to overtake the plot. The plot is fairly basic, and also the kind of atmospherics Conrad develops, the ambience, the ecological ambience, especially of the whole place. Now, of course, if we are reading Conrad in an existentialist way, which has often been the case, we could think of all this as a certain depiction or a portrayal of the human condition in a very general, abstract, philosophical sense. But one of the problems with that reading is that Conrad never quite gives us that general picture of the human condition. What he's talking about is a very specific historical situation and a very situated condition, to put it like that. It's not some general human abstraction, right? Even though, of course, there would be strong similarities between the existentialist worldview of angst and despair and meaninglessness and the kind of worldview we have, especially in Almayer's own disposition. But that's one of the problems of reading Conrad as a sort of existentialist, because it partially sort of banalizes the kind of context and takes away from the context that he himself is developing. Um, so one of the things that we were talking about is this very strong sense of precarity, this darkness and this precarity that looms large on this landscape. The river seems to have a life of its own, and it doesn't seem to be all that merciful towards the human population there. In fact, the human habitation seems to pretty much, hang on a very tight thread, a thread that might cut itself at any point. Chapter 6 is Dane Marula visiting Lakamba, the local king. So Dane Marula is, of course, the prince who comes from Bali. He's not completely local. He meets Lakamba and Babalachi, the slave, in this particular chapter. And this chapter gives us some detail about what's happening. There's a gunpowder smuggling. It seems that there's a gunpowder smuggling that is happening, and that's a kind of a local problem that both Babalachi and his master, Lakamba, the local king, they're so deeply steeped into that, they're not in a position to do anything about it or go against it at all. And there are, in these conversations, there's this sort of, mocking remark that, does the rounds about the White Raja. The White Raja is Tom Lingard, who has become a kind of Raja Lout, as we were saying the other day. It gives us some information about the sort of half settlement of the Duchess. So I was saying, that this is a very conflictual cosmopolitanism that we see in this place. In fact, I missed out on the Arabs. There are Arabs too. So there's Chinese people, there's Arabs, there's Dutch colonialism, there's a sort of a British settlement, which again doesn't quite, find a lot of, ground in this place. And then, of course, there are Malayan kings, local kings, and then there are sort of oddballs like Almayer coming in, a white man with a dream to set up a business there and find gold mines. So we see that kind of, again, that conflictual cosmopolitanism quite a bit in this chapter in the conversations between Dane and Lakamba, and then Dane and Babalachi. The gunpowder smuggling is mentioned on page 60. Now, of course, they are all talking about fights, conflicts, bombing places, bombing ships, etc., etc. But there's also this sort of poignance about, especially Lakamba, and Babalachi. So let me read out this little section on page 61. For all his ferocious talk, the merciful ruler, this is Lakamba, would not kill him, as in not kill, uh, because there was a conversation just before where Lakamba said, I could possibly kill you. That seems like a better solution than all these other things you're proposing. But here the narrator is saying Lakamba would never do such a thing as to kill Dane Marula. So for all his ferocious talk, the merciful ruler would not kill him, for he had long ago been impressed with the notion that Dane possessed the secret of the white man's treasure. Neither would he give him up to the Dutch for fear of some fatal disclosure of complicity in the treasonable trade. So Dane felt tolerably secure as he sat meditating quietly his answer to the Raja's bloodthirsty speech. So Dane has a sort of trump card, and that's perhaps the whereabouts of the gold mine, which he's supposed to know. And he will not, he's not someone who will disclose the secret. So Dane seems to be taken as a man of principle and not as someone who will betray or let it out. Dane is asked to go into some sort of a hiding. Why? We will get to know very soon. He has done something that makes him a lawbreaker in that sense. While they're talking, we always have this very strong presence of the ambience, as I'm saying. There was a constant rumble of distant thunder, punctuated by the nearer sharp crashes. And in the continuous play of blue lightning, the woods and the river showed fitfully, with the elusive distinctness of detail characteristic of such a scene. So again, I mean, the atmosphere is always there, even when the focus is on human conversation, the atmosphere seems to make its presence felt as this sort of looming entity, as it were. And then Babalachi says, "This is a great flood. The river is very angry. Look at the drifting logs. Can you go?" So he's not very sure whether Dane Marula should travel in the middle of this storm that is cooking up in the river. The recurrent image of all these drifting logs, we have seen this from the very beginning. If you remember, yesterday we were talking about how the character of Almayer seems to identify itself with one of these logs, sailing away or floating away in the river's course, as it were. Um, Again, the fact that I was talking about this poignance, right? This poignance of old age, the fact that both Lakamba and Babalachi, they might talk about adventurism, they're not young anymore. And this is a very interesting passage on page 63, where the narrator goes, "The ruler was growing old, and Babalachi, aware of an uneasy feeling at the pit of his stomach, put both his hands there with a suddenly vivid and sad perception of the fact that he himself was growing old too. That the time of reckless daring was past for both of them, and that they had to seek refuge in prudent cunning. They wanted peace. They were disposed to reform. They were ready even to retrench so as to have the wherewithal to bribe the evil days away, if bribed away they could be." So this is again the kind of poignance I'm talking about, a sort of spent force or a feeling of having been past one's prime. That's something that we see in both the master and the slave. And in this movement of time, in this sort of very strong note of aging, we also see a presence of death, again in a sort of very Hegelian triad: the master, the slave, and death. Both the master and the slave are growing old, have grown old. They know that their days of adventurism are in the past. Um, so there's this apprehension that Babalachi keeps having, almost in a prophetic way, that he might get drowned, in the storm, Dane Marula. But Dane Marula doesn't listen. He leaves in the middle of the storm. Babalachi says he ran down the river like a man possessed of the shaitan. Lakamba wants Dane Marula to live, but wants Almayer to die. This is the contrast. So he wants Almayer to die because Almayer knows too much about this whole smuggling business and so on. And again, he cannot trust Almayer because Almayer is the white man, right? So the white man is not supposed to be trusted. The Malayans cannot seem to trust the white man. I mean, one of the things that maybe I'll talk about this a little bit later on in more detail, but one of the things that we see is a reciprocally conflictual relation, a reciprocally not just conflictual, but also a reciprocally skeptical relation between the races, especially the white man and the local, the Malayan, right? It's not just the white man's distrust of the Malayans, but vice versa too. The Malayans' distrust of the white man, right? So the relationship is reciprocally judgmental, stereotypical, in the sense that one stereotypes the other, not stereotypical, but stereotyping, so to speak. There's a characteristic urge that we see in both these communities to stereotype the other. What is interesting in Conrad is that you don't see a one-sided view. You don't have a one-sided view of this, othering, this racial othering or racial alienation, whatever you want to call it. It's not one-sided. It's happening from both ends, and the sort of plurivocal novel is talking about these things across, the different voices. Let me see something in the chat box. Yeah, absolutely. The Dutch judge Almayer as well. So it's mutual judgment. What is happening? We'll see a little bit more of this as we go on today. Babalachi seems to have this bad feeling about the fact that Dame Marula left in the middle of the storm. So again, we have this slightly meditative moment. Babalachi's hand grasped the handle with the energy of despair, and he turned. And as he turned, the deep gloom of his countenance changed into an expression of hopeless resignation. So from deep gloom to hopeless resignation, kind of stoicism creeping in. Nature slept, I'm just skipping a few lines. Nature slept in an exhausted repose after the fierce turmoil, while under the unsteady hand of the statesman of Sambir, and it goes on like that. So that's the end of this chapter. We go into chapter 7 now. Now, what happens in chapter 7 in terms of the plot is something important. So next morning, after the stormy night, there's a body found quite close to Almayer's house. And they apprehend that it's Dame Marula's body because there's a gold anklet attached to the body. The head is gone. It's taken away. So we don't know for sure whether it's Dame Marula, but that seems to be the sort of despairing apprehension of both Almayer and his daughter, Nina. It's a day of bright sunshine, clear, mistless morning, but something awful is about to happen. I'm just reading from the first page of chapter 7, from page 66. Mrs. Almayer, in her savage moods, when excited by the reminiscences of the piratical period of her life, had torn off the curtains to make sarongs for the slave girls and had burned the showy furniture piecemeal to cook the family rice. But Almayer was not thinking of his furniture now. He was thinking of Dane's return, of Dane's nocturnal interview with Lakamba, of its possible influence on his long matured plans, now nearing the period of their execution. So, as I say, Dane Marula is like a ticket to the gold mine as far as Almayer is concerned. So, you can understand how difficult it would be for him to take the fact that he might be dead. The sense of the unwanted solitude, this is about Almayer, grew upon him suddenly, and in the unusual silence, he caught himself longing even for the usually unwelcome sound of his wife's voice to break the oppressive stillness which seemed, to his frightened fancy, to portend the advent of some new misfortune. The new misfortune is very much coming, as we have already said. Now, again, we have this emphasis on the voice of the wife. That's how the novel had opened, right? If you remember. There's a man among the logs, Muhammad, this local guy, comes in and says, there's a body of a man in the river, come and see a dead stranger. And there's an interesting passage here, which is again, not connected to the main narrative, so to speak, but just after the dead body is mentioned, we have this reference. They took up the cry shrilly, and it traveled so from house to house, dying away in the distance. And then this part, the men rushed out excited but silent and ran towards the muddy point where the unconscious logs tossed and ground and bumped and rolled over the dead stranger with a stupid persistency of inanimate things. It's quite interesting, right? I mean, there's again this recurrent image of the log coming back in, and there are these sort of, seemingly post-human kind of uh, moments of uh, reflection on the object, on the inanimate matter of the world, so to speak. It's interesting because, of course, the inanimate matter and the corpse go hand in hand. It's not a body that is alive anymore. So there's a part of course, there's a certain way of thinking. I mean, not a part, there's a way of thinking that might connect the corpse, the figure of the corpse, with inanimate matter. But we go back to that particular comparison between the human being and these logs floating in and around the river. In this case, the log represents the sort of feeble promise of human habitation in this, dark ecology, as it were. So the stupid persistency of inanimate things, quite a memorable expression. So these logs are still sort of, picking away, as it were, at the corpse, long after it is dead. And again, we have references to the murmur of the crowd. So again, all these invocatory references, voice coming in. Babalachi comes in, his head is covered by a red turban. He was always apprehensive about Dane Marula's leaving in the middle of the storm, and it seems like his prophecy had come true, or something like that. Nina is not there at that point, so when Almayer comes out, and sees the corpse, and when they finally find the anklet, he's absolutely sure it must be Dane Marula. When he cannot find Nina, he of course fears something has happened to her as well. So we have this moment, he pushed blindly and violently forward, the crowd falling back with cries of surprise and pain before his frantic advance. What does Mrs. Almayer do? Mrs. Almayer threw her own head veil over the upturned face of the drowned man, and squatting by it with another mournful howl, sent a shiver through the now silent crowd. Muhammad, dripping wet, turned to Almayer, eager to tell his tale. So why did this happen is what they are wondering about, what this crowd is sort of wondering about. And at one point, in fact, Muhammad says, have we not enough ghosts about this place? So something like this had to happen on top of all other spookiness that is there anyway. In fact, Muhammad finds the anklet, and it's a gold anklet. That's what makes them think it must be the prince who would have a gold anklet just like that. And he takes the gold anklet. So these are little interesting moments, again, anthropologically speaking, these are interesting moments in the community. It's a poor community, but when you see a corpse and when you see an anklet, the first thought that comes to your mind in this case is, I should have the anklet. I saw it, and the man is dead. There's no good. What will he do with an anklet anymore? So these little things are little details, say something about community practice, community life, and the frugality of their situation as well. Okay. The women went first, dragging away the children that hung back with all their weight on the maternal hand. The men strolled slowly. This is the procession that is happening when the body is taken away, the procession of mourning. And they're all in mourning because they think it's Dane Marula. So Babalachi tells the story, says, he left last night when the storm was great and the river spoke angrily. So again, you see the active human presence of the river. The night was very black, but he had within him a light that showed the way to your house, as smooth as a narrow backwater, and the many logs no bigger than wisps of dried grass. Therefore he went, and now he lies here. And Babalachi nodded his head towards the body. So this light is, of course, associated with the the light of love, as it were. We've already seen this, how, light and darkness, these images have been used in relation to the relationship that is forming between Nina and Dane Marula. There's this interesting psychological image of a fall on page 72. This is Almayer's reaction. This is Almayer waking up to the fact that his last ticket to the gold mine has been snatched away from him. He has absolutely no way of finding the gold mines anymore. I'm just going to read this passage in parts. Almayer raised his hands to his head and let them fall listlessly by his sides in the utter abandonment of despair. Babalachi, looking at him curiously, was astonished to see him smile. A strange fancy had taken possession of Almayer's brain, distracted by this new misfortune. It seemed to him that for many years he had been falling down a deep precipice. Day after day, month after month, year after year, he had been falling. It was a smooth, round, black thing, and the black walls had been rushing upwards with wearisome rapidity. A great rush, the noise of which he fancied he could hear yet. And now, with an awful shock, he had reached the bottom. And behold, he was alive and whole. It goes on like that. So this, this psychic image of falling to the bottom of a well, as it were, and his entire life is like a fall. He has always been falling, as it were. This is an interesting image. And when he says a dead Malay, he had seen many dead Malays without any emotion. So again, says something about that whole, interracial notion of the value of life. And now he felt inclined to weep. But it was over the fate of a white man, he knew, a man that fell over a deep precipice and did not die. So for him, the death of Dane Marula is like his own death. So he's crying over a white man's death. But what we see in this passage is this conviction that a white man's life is more valuable than a Malayan life. And that's, again, typical of the kind of perspective Almayer seems to have. He seemed somehow to himself to be standing on one side, a little way off, looking at a certain Almayer. So you see a moment of self-alienation here. Almayer watches himself. In psychological language, we call this self-observation. People sometimes actually have these moments of self-observation where they can see themselves at another spot looking at their own other, right? That's exactly what happens. This is a moment of self-observation. So he seemed somehow to himself to be standing on one side, a little way off, looking at a certain Almayer who was in great trouble. See the self-observation element? Poor fella. Why doesn't he cut his throat? So this is the suicidal thought now. He wished to encourage him. He was very anxious to see him lying dead over that other corpse. So, and then he thinks himself, was he going mad? Not mad, he wants to say to himself. But there's a sense of going mad here because of the suicidal thought, because of this whole, image of fall that we have, which would again perhaps remind us of Lord Jim. These are again classic existentialist images, but the point I'm trying to make, of course, one could say, this is this could be read through the whole idea of abyss, existential abyss that both Heidegger and Kierkegaard in very different ways talk about. But this is very situated, and it's particular and situational, not a universal human condition that is being painted, at least not overtly by Conrad. And Nina finally comes back, and her father is at least thankful about that. Nina doesn't quite react. She seems to be quite stoned, in fact, by what has happened. And that leads to, Nietzsche's abyss too. Yeah, why not? What is interesting here is, there's a sort of an accusation between the father and the daughter here. When Nina doesn't react to Dane Marula's death, that seems to enrage Almayer. And Almayer accuses his daughter, yes, he's dead. Do you understand? Dead. What do you care? You never cared. You saw me struggle and work and strive unmoved, and my suffering you could never see. No, never. You have no heart and you have no mind, or you would have understood that it was for you, For your happiness, I was working. I wanted to be rich. I wanted to get away from here. I wanted to see white men bowing low before the power of your beauty and your wealth. Old as I am, I wish to seek a strange land, a civilization to which I'm a stranger, so as to find a new life in the contemplation of your high fortunes, and so on. It's very typical. This is like a father, in a way, projecting his own desire onto the daughter. What is interesting is, you know, we can ask this question: is it actually true? Is it Almayer's own dreams, or are these all dreams that he has for his daughter? The other thing that is interesting here is that he wants white men to wake up to her beauty. He's caught between two cultures, clearly, because he's the husband of a Malayan woman. He's also the father of a half caste, so to speak. So in a way, he finds himself in that position where he cannot absolutely loathe the Malay people either, because his daughter is one of them, or at least half, belonging to that particular community. So he cannot have a complete hatred of them. And and we will see this very soon, in fact, there's a way in which, even though her beauty is acknowledged by white men, because she's racially hybrid, she's not considered as attractive or as as covetous as she would be if she were a white woman. So he wants that kind of honor, that pride, that white prestige for Nina. Whether or not it's entirely true that he wants everything that he wants for her and not for himself, we don't know about that. We're not sure about that. But as I say, this is a very typical, point or a moment in a father's conversation, in a paternal discourse, where the father would entirely project all the desires he might have had onto the son or the daughter, in this case, the daughter. And he goes on like this: have you no feeling? Have you lived without hope? And all these things. And all these accusations are coming in only because she's not reacting to the death of Dane Marula. And this is very, at one level, it's quite funny because he doesn't know that she has fallen in love with Dane Marula. And the reaction of stagnation, or the reaction of being stoned, is partially because she doesn't know how to react. He doesn't know that there's this relationship. So for him, she's supposed to react to his death because, after all, he was the mastermind who would have taken them to the gold mine. This particular train of thought is continued on the next page, on page 74, but there's a little bit of a sadism creeping in here, which is quite interesting. I believe you're an idiot, he yelled. And he goes on to say many things. I'll just pick up on one or two things. He thought so in perfect good faith, deceived by the emotional estimate of his motives, unable to see the crookedness of his ways, the unreality of his aims, the futility of his regrets. So you see how the narrator is also distancing himself a little bit from Almayer, right? It's not always that the narrator is identifying with Almayer. And now his heart was filled only with a great tenderness and love for his daughter. He wanted to see her miserable and to share with her his despair. But he wanted it only as all weak natures long for a companionship in misfortune with beings innocent of its cause. This is very interesting. It's a kind of a sadomasochism, as it were. But what is interesting is that the sadomasochism here seems to be an expression of love. I love you, and as a result, I want you to suffer so that I, one sufferer, can identify with you, another sufferer, and that will cement or bolster our, romantic exchange, as it were, or love, whatever love or affection I might have for the other person. So this co-belonging of two sufferers, but if you actively want the other person to suffer, because you think of yourself as a sufferer, and then that other person will become a co-sufferer, and hence will strengthen your love relationship with that other person. This is a kind of a sadomasochistic thinking. As the narrator calls it, these are weak natures longing for companionship in misfortune. This is also called the violence of feelings, the violence of feelings that found relief at last in sobs and tears. So finally, he broke down. Yeah, so I just wanted to draw your attention to this sort of affective angle, which is quite strongly played out here. Nina sighed deeply, but had this understated reaction, which her father didn't quite understand. Um, Almayer had this sort of appeal for sympathy, or kind of sympathy seeking, if you like. Um, yeah, I'm just going to skip a little bit here. The end of the chapter again gives a certain kind of agency to the ambience. So we have this particular, the sound, the sharp report from the gun mounted in the bow of the steam launch that was just then coming into view arrested the words on her parted lips. And then there's this echo which seems to come from the place itself. From the hills far away, the echo came back like a long drawn and mournful sigh, as if the land had sent its answer to the voice of its masters. So, again, you see how the land seems to acquire a kind of agency and a subversive agency to give it back to the voice of the masters. And again, mark the word voice there. Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is, I think, particularly interesting because of the way it delves into Tamina, Bulangi's slave girl. And there's quite a complicated and very ambiguous character portraiture of Tamina that happens in this chapter, which is what I would like to draw your attention to. Um, Abdullah, one of the characters, Abdullah Rashid, these are all local. They're part of the local establishment. Abdullah says one thing which is perhaps important here. Again, as I was talking about these reciprocal judgments, the white man's rewards are long in coming. Abdullah says, white men are quick in anger and slow in gratitude. We shall see. So again, this as I said, the sort of interracial judgments are reciprocal. Tamina is presented on page 80, and she's sort of walking her way. And then we have this sort of slow unraveling of her psyche, the psyche of a slave, but also the psyche of a woman who is in love with Dame Marula and cannot stand, Nina, because Nina seems to be the woman Dame Marula is after or completely enamored by. There's all that jealousy coming in. So this particular character portrayal is very interesting because on the one hand, you might say that Conrad is almost dehumanizing, or the narrator, let's say Conrad's narrator, is almost dehumanizing, animalizing Tamina. But on the other hand, she comes across as this extremely complex woman with a mind of her own, with a very complex set of emotions, feelings, affects, whatever you want to call them. So it's a kind of a double portraiture or a dual portraiture. It's very ambiguous at that level. She seems to have some sort of an unconscious resignation. This is an expression that is used on page 81. She knew of no other sky. Let me just read this part. The slave had no hope and knew of no change. She knew of no other sky, no other water, no other forest, no other world, no other life. I'm just skipping a few lines. Uh, the absence of pain and hunger was her happiness. And when she felt unhappy, she was simply tired more than usual after the day's labor. So you see this animalization, a kind of instinctive creature. She's more like an instinctive creature. The only happiness she knows is the absence of pain, which is, of course, at some level quite simplistic. And absence of hunger is happiness for her. I mean, again, it's double edged. On the one hand, you could say it's a sort of an animalistic, dehumanized portrayal. But on the other hand, it also draws our attention to the importance of this, to use a sort of Agambenian expression, the importance of bare life. This is life stripped to its absolutely minimal or bare parameters, right? Now, this is the life of a slave. The slave cannot expect a lot. If the slave is fed well, or if there's no hunger in the body of the slave, that makes him happy, or in this case, her happy. So it's interesting. At one level, you could think of this as a realistic portraiture of the very condition of the slave, but at another level, you could read this as a kind of animalization. But is she all that simple? That's something that we will, soon find out. Um, Bulangi was there by the door. His wife was further in. The children and the mother with their mothers. She could hear their breathing. Bulangi's sleepy voice, the sharp cry of a child soon hushed with tender words. And she closed her eyes to the murmur of the water below her, to the whisper of the warm wind above. See all these invocations. These are all invocatory images. Murmur of the water, whisper of the warm wind, ignorant of the never ceasing life of the tropical nature that spoke to her in vain with 1,000 faint voices of their forest. So again, she seems to be at one with the ecology. She's not, just see one thing here. She's not feeling as precarious as some of the white men are feeling. She finds herself at home in this dark ecology. It's not that dark for her, in other words. Her jealousy, again, the voice of nature speaking to her. When she hears Nina's voice, she hates the sound of that voice because, of course, this woman becomes the object of attention for Dane Marula, and that's what Tamina wants. Her jealousy and rage, again, I'm reading from page 83, her jealousy and rage culminated in a paroxysm of physical pain that left her lying panting on the riverbank in the dumb agony of a wounded animal. So again, you see the analogy of the animal, how that is being used. And yet, she's not an animal. Jealousy in itself is a fairly complex emotion. And it goes on, again, I'm skipping a little bit on the same page, 83. Tamina's heart, where lay useless and barren the seeds of all love and of all hate, the possibilities of all passions and of all sacrifices, forgot its joys and its sufferings when deprived of the help of the senses. Her half-formed savage mind, the slave of her body, as her body was the slave of another's will. Forgot the faint and vague image of the ideal that had found its beginning in the physical promptings of her savage nature. So what is interesting here is that against the grain of this description, almost despite itself, it seems to complexify and humanize Tamina. Though the predominant grain seems to be, simplification, animalization, dehumanization, and all of that. She's a half-formed savage mind. But at the same time, just before the narrator says she's a half-formed savage mind, the narrator also says she has possibilities of all passions, all emotions in her. Right? So it's quite contradictory at one level, or there's a tension that we see in this portrayal, which is typical of that kind of racial ideological ambivalence that Conrad shows almost throughout his work. The dying jealousy. It was like the dreary tranquility of a desert where there's peace only because there's no life. Does that mean then her mind is lifeless? Her mind doesn't have a life of its own? But then the entire description seems to suggest otherwise. So this tension and this kind of antinomy is quite interesting. Once again, the voice is mentioned here. Now, again, I can't read out everything, but what we also find very interesting in this detailed sort of, portrayal of slave psychology, as it were, is this triad, the romantic triad that gets developed. On the one hand, of course, she hates Tamina. Tamina hates Nina because, for obvious reasons, right? But on the other hand, she's also someone who wants to be like Nina because she wants to be, the object of Dane Marula's attention. So she keeps thinking, what does this other woman have that I don't? And why is he after her and not after me? This question leads us to this very, almost a disturbing moment where it seems like she doesn't simply hate Nina, but possibly has feelings for her. So does she love him so much that she has fallen in love with the woman he loves? That's where the triad becomes a little bit complicated. What was there in her? This is the question she keeps asking on page 85. And again, she knew it well. She regretted that he was not dead. She should have liked Dane to be dead so as to be parted from that woman, from all women, right? So, there's a part of her that thinks, if Dane doesn't quite, attend to her, he shouldn't attend to anyone else. It's quite a destructive, possessive kind of love she seems to have for Dane. I think this is perhaps the most significant part of this chapter, which is why I kind of dwelt on it a little bit longer. Again, Almayer, when two officers come in, again, we see the sort of racialization here. It's a great pleasure to see white faces here, Almayer says on page 87. I've lived here many years in great solitude. The Malays, you understand, are not company for a white man. Moreover, they're not friendly. They do not understand our ways. So this is, I think, the predominant vision that comes out of a book like this, that the two shall never meet. The world of one culture and the world of another, there are these unbridgeable gaps, and to the point that they don't understand each other. They cannot understand each other, as it were. Right. Yeah. So there's that, almost a thesis of, the conflict of the races, like the battle of the sexes, the battle of the races, kind of a leviathan, so to speak, in that sense. The human conflict is particularly racialized here. So now we understand, there's an important piece of information that is conveyed here. Now we understand that this is the crime Dane Marula has committed. He has blown up a ship with almost 40 white men. And Dane Marula is, and this is where we start understanding it, it will become more and more clear. Dane Marula is a political radical. He's a bit of a revolutionary. He's not just a prince. He's someone who wants to sort of, radically go against white colonialism in this area and wants to free this place or decolonize this place. So we have that sort of decolonization element, political decolonization, not epistemological or in another way that, Ngugi and others have talked about. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go on. So the officers have come to him because, of course, he has had dealings with this radical revolutionary who has killed 40 white men, and white lives matter, right? According to this vision, of course. You've broken the law, Mr. Almayer, and you ought to make amends. And save myself, Almayer says. Well, in a sense, yes, your head is not in any danger. He has not done anything, but he has kept company with this man who has clearly done something. That's the conversation. Now, it's interesting, when Nina appears in the middle of all this, one of the white officers is quite taken by her beauty, but he decides to sort of, let her go, or let her go unattended, so to speak. This is page 90, the last paragraph of chapter 8. It's interesting because this is exactly what I was talking about. Let me just read this out quickly. The young sub began to recover from the astonishment and confusion caused by Nina's unexpected appearance and great beauty. She is very beautiful and imposing, he reflected. But after all, a half-caste girl, right? This is the problem. And this is the point that the father wants to rectify. The father wants the white man to wake up to her beauty. This thought caused him to pluck up heart and look at Nina sideways. Nina, with composed face, was answering in a low, even voice the elder officer's polite questions as to the country and her mode of life. Another thing that is interesting here is that it seems like, to put it very crudely, if you have the money, doesn't matter what your skin color is. That seems to be the goal of Almayer. Almayer knows that he has a half-caste daughter, and he wants, good things to happen to her life, in her life, and he knows that will only happen if they get a lot of money, where money will, erase race, as it were. So what we have is an interesting kind of a classic battle of modernity, economy on the one hand, and all these identity discourses, in this case, race, but one could say this about gender and caste and class and some of the other questions as well. And class is specifically economic, right? Class has a sort of economic character. What changes in caste, gender, race when class is something that improves, or when you move from a relatively lower to a relatively upper class, economic upliftment? What does that do? That seems to be a question here. Okay, I think we have to be a little bit quicker so that we can finish at least this chapter, chapter 9. Um, can I believe what you tell me? It's like a tale for men that listen only half awake by the campfire, and it seems to have run off a woman's tongue. So again, can we believe in stories that are told by women? So once again, we have this kind of sexism, latent sexism, which is perhaps presented as an anthropological reality, not necessarily an author-backed reality, but an anthropological reality. Uh, who is who is there here for me to deceive, O Raja? So this is a conversation between, not between white men. This is a conversation between the Malayan Raja Lakamba and Babalachi. Without you, I'm nothing. So again, all I've told you, I believe to be true. So this is Babalachi telling the story of what could have happened to Dane. The fact that Dane is not dead. Perhaps he's in hiding and he has done all this. He's killed 40 white men, and this is what Babalachi is narrating to his master in Bulangi's clearing. So they think that he must be hiding in Bulangi's clearing. That's why Tamina knows about it. The white man's daughter took him there. So this is perhaps another reason why Nina didn't react the way she could have reacted, because she was doubtful at that point, and she came to know later that it was not Dane, that body was not Dane's, and he's alive. Um, and again, this reference when Babalachi says, she's like a white woman and knows no shame. So again, you have that peek into what I was calling a kind of reciprocal judgment. She's a white woman and she doesn't have any shame. Right. So this is again Lakamba and Babalachi talking about it. Almayer, now they don't want to kill Almayer anymore. They want Dane to escape and Almayer to live. Basically, that's the plan now. Because there's a way in which they think they might be able to extract the treasure from the white man if the treasure is ever found. So again, we go back to that sort of chimera of the gold mine. I think the gold mine itself works like a symbol here, a symbol of human desire, but also a symbol of colonialism, a symbol of something that doesn't exist. The gold mine, as it were, is that sort of absent signifier at the very core of this entire colonial project. The colonial project seems to, or the project of desire seems to sort of move around this lacking object, the lacking object being the gold mine. It's there everywhere in the ecology, but it's not there as that fetishized object. So again, we see the gold in this metaphor. For example, on page 94, this is Babalachi looking at the river Pantai, and it's a beautiful description, where it broke and sparkled in thousands of glittering wavelets, like a band woven of azure and gold, edged with the brilliant green of the forests, guarding both banks of the Pantai. So again, you see there's gold everywhere, but there's no gold anywhere. It's a bit like that. It's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It's like that chimera of colonialism, the missing signifier, as I was saying. Okay, let's just move a little bit faster. Okay. So again, I mean, we keep having these moments of outburst from Almayer, and now Almayer is saying this disloyalty and unscrupulousness. What have you ever done to make me loyal? You have no grip on this country. I had to take care of myself, and when I asked for protection, I was met with threats and contempt, and had Arab slander thrown in my face. I, a white man. This is page 98, and this is Almayer talking to the officials, the Dutch officials. And again, the Dutch will partially, take away this point that they've not been able to establish a kind of complete authority over this place as they would have liked. So what comes out in Almayer's frustration is once again a kind of white pride, that he was not protected enough by other white men, by people of his own race, and he had to be, subjugated by all these other inferior races. There's a sense of inferiorization here, inferiorization of the other races, that I had to take Arab slander, I had to take, all kinds of Malayan mockeries and things like that. Nina has a moment of, a rare moment of expression here on page 100. And this is very interesting. So, this is a conversation with the white officials. And Nina says, "And he killed white men?" interrupted Nina. "I regret to say they were white. Yes, two white men lost their lives through that scoundrel's freak." So, this is a reference to Dane Marula. "Two only?" exclaimed Nina. The officer looked at her in amazement. "Why? Why?" "You," he stammered, confused. "There might have been more," interrupted Nina. "And when you get this scoundrel, will you go?" The lieutenant, still speechless, bowed his assent. "Then I would get him for you, if I had to seek him in a burning fire." And then, she goes on, "I hate the sight of your white faces. I hate the sound of your gentle voices. That is the way you speak to women, dropping sweet words before any pretty face. I've heard your voices before. I hope to live here without seeing any other white face but this." And by this, she refers to her father. She added in a gentler tone, touching lightly her father's cheek. So again, you have a moment of a racial outburst, but also a gender voice. This is a quasi-feminist voice speaking, and the voice, on the other hand, in the very sentences, if you heard them, the word voice is used to denote the voice of patriarchy, the kind of voice of male gaze, as it were. So there are these moments of, Nina's feminist self-expression, with a very strong, tender care for the white man that is her father, though. "Father, father," she cried, bending over him with passionate entreaty. "See those two men looking at us. Send them away. I cannot bear it anymore. Send them away. Do what they want and let them go." So she just wants white men to leave them alone, and she's even willing to take them to Dane Marula and have him cut, uh, only if they would leave. It's that bad. Again, the great stillness and murmur of the flowing water, and these things are mentioned, and they're recurrently mentioned, of course, throughout the book. Let me just, yeah, and this is an interesting point. On page 103, the Dutch officials actually agree with what Almayer and his daughter, especially Almayer, was saying. They say that drunken madman was right. We haven't enough hold on this coast. They do what they like. Are our hammocks slung? So you see this sort of, insecure colonialism and the fact that, we don't have enough power, as it seems. Perhaps, the white man was right. Uh, and this chapter ends with, again, that very strong sense of ambience. The moon mounted higher, and the warm shadows grew smaller and crept away as if hiding before the cold and cruel light. So there's something cold and cruel about the moonlight here. This is not the light of, love, or the sunshine that was mentioned before. Let's stop here. We are well on our way in terms of finishing uh, finishing two-thirds of the book. So I think we have around 40 pages, which should be fine for tomorrow. Questions before we finish? We're almost at the end.
Sir,
But yeah, you don't mind. Go ahead.
sir, is I think that would you agree with the fact that opium is an important motive in this text, because this text, historically speaking, is written in the shadow of the opium wars in China. So would
Hmm.
you agree that opium is an important motive and a motive of colonization itself?
No, that's an interesting context. I hadn't really given that a lot of thought, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, historically, that is true. And opium has always been, in terms of opium trades and all of that, that has always been a major, let's say, driving force for colonial conquests in different parts of the world, especially because we are talking about Indonesia here, and China is, not that far away at all. So there is that. And we see the presence of the Chinese towards the end of the book. We might talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. But yeah, you're right. Anything else? Okay. So we could stop here then, and I'll try and finish a little bit earlier tomorrow if possible, so that we can have a slightly more detailed conversation if you have questions, any final questions about the novel. Okay, so I'll see you. Let me just stop the recording. I'll see you tomorrow at the same time, 11.